They gave us back our minds and called it mercy. I remember the first morning with real clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when you've spent years in the dark and someone finally strikes a match. I stood in the processing corridor of Facility 7 with my hands at my sides and my eyes on the floor, and I breathed, very carefully, the way the counselors had taught us. In through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth. One of the orderlies, a young woman, maybe 23, with a clipboard pressed hard against her chest like a shield, watched me from across the corridor, and I understood. I didn't blame her. I would have done the same. My name is Senan. I was 26 years old when the maize virus took me, and 31 when they gave me back. 5 years. 5 years of nothing but hunger and noise and the red animal dark, and then a needle in the arm and 6 months of white rooms and careful questions, and the slow, terrible return of everything I had done. That's what they don't tell you about the cure. It isn't redemption, it's memory. The resistant, the ones the cure couldn't reach, you could almost envy them in certain moments. Almost. They didn't have to carry what I carried. They didn't wake at 3 in the morning with the smell of it still in their throats. They didn't know what they were. They just were. Pure appetite, pure instinct, coordinated in ways that nobody fully understood, moving through the ruins of the evacuation zones in loose formations that the military called swarms and the scientists called something more clinical. A distributed intelligence, a shared nervous system spread across hundreds of bodies, not a hive exactly, something older than that, something that had no word in any language spoken by people who'd never been inside it. I had been inside it. That was the thing they never quite asked about in the facility interviews. They asked what I remembered. They asked whether I experienced distress. They asked me to rate, on a scale of 1 to 10, the frequency of intrusive thoughts. But they never asked what the inside of that coordination felt like. Maybe they were afraid of the answer. I will tell you what it felt like. It felt like belonging. That's the part that has kept me awake more nights than any specific memory. Not what I did, what I felt while I was doing it. The pull of the others, wordless and warm, the sense of moving inside something larger than yourself, every decision arriving not as a thought but as a tide. You didn't choose. You flowed. And there was a relief in it so profound that sometimes, in the processing corridor of Facility 7, breathing carefully the way the counselors had taught me, I had to fight very hard to remember why I had wanted to come back. I came back because of Luke. Luke was my brother. He was 2 years older than me, steady where I was restless, cautious where I was not. He had married a woman named Abigail Abbey, she insisted, always Abby, who was American and worked as a correspondent for a news organization based in Dublin. They had a son named Cillian. Cillian was 4 when the maize virus swept through the city and Luke didn't make it to the evacuation point. I won't tell you what happened to Luke. Not yet. That knowledge sat inside me like a stone for the 6 months of processing, and it sits inside me still. And if I am going to tell this story properly, you need to understand first who we were when we came out. You need to understand Connor. Connor Ryan had been a barrister before. He was the kind of man who filled a room without trying, not loud, not aggressive, just present in a way that made other people rearrange themselves around him. In the facility, he had attached himself to me early, and I let him because I was frightened and he was not frightened, or at least he performed not being frightened with complete conviction, which amounts to the same thing when you're sleeping in a bunk 2 feet from someone. We were in the same processing cohort. We were assigned adjacent rooms. By the time they told us we were being released in the 3rd reintegration wave, I could not quite imagine navigating the outside world without him standing somewhere nearby. I should have paid more attention to what that feeling was, that pull, that tide. The morning they released us, Connor took me aside in the corridor before we went to collect our discharge papers. He put one hand on my shoulder and he looked at me with those flat, measuring eyes of his, and he said, quietly, that I was not to tell Abby what happened to Luke, that it would serve no one, that the kindest thing, the only rational thing, was to let her go on believing he had simply not survived the chaos of the outbreak years, which was true enough from a certain angle. I said I understood. I did not understand. I told myself I did, because Connor had a way of making his reasoning feel like your own reasoning, and because part of me genuinely wanted to believe that silence was kindness. But I knew, walking out of Facility 7 into the thin Dublin morning, that I was carrying a debt I did not know how to pay. Abby was waiting at the checkpoint gate. She was thinner than I remembered from before, but her eyes were the same, sharp and watchful and warm in a way that arrived later than the sharpness. She embraced me carefully, the way people embrace the returned, with their arms fully committed but their bodies held slightly back, an unconscious flinch they can't help. She smelled of coffee and the particular soap they sold at the corner chemist near the house we used to share, all of us, before. Cillian was 9 now and stood behind her left hip and studied me with the frank curiosity of a child who has been told something important and is checking whether it matches the evidence. I told him I was his Uncle Senan. He said he knew that. I asked if he remembered me. He said not really. That seemed right. The house was smaller than memory had made it, or I was larger, somehow, thickened in the wrong places, moving with a carefulness that people who have not been through it find unsettling. I had been assigned to a rehabilitation officer named Cantor, Sergeant Cantor, who came by the house 3 days after my release to conduct what the discharge paperwork called an integration assessment. He was a compact man in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had decided long ago not to offer anything for free. He sat across from me at Abby's kitchen table and asked his questions with the practiced neutrality of someone reading from a script he had memorized but did not believe in. He asked whether I was experiencing difficulties with the transition. I said the nights were hard. He asked whether I had made contact with any other reintegrated individuals outside of approved support channels. I said I had seen Connor. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not alarm exactly. Something more controlled than alarm. He wrote something in his notebook and closed it and told me, with the same practiced neutrality, that individuals like Connor Ryan represented a particular category of concern, that the rehabilitation office had a file, that I should be careful. I told him I understood. Connor, when I told him what Cantor had said, laughed. It was a short, dry sound, almost clinical. We were sitting in the back of a cafe near the Liffey that catered to the cured because nobody else came in anymore. The owner had tried for 2 weeks after the first reintegration wave to keep a mixed clientele, and had given up after the windows were broken 3 times in a fortnight. Connor wrapped his hands around his tea and looked out at the river, and told me that men like Cantor were the problem, that they had decided what we were before we had a chance to decide for ourselves. He wasn't entirely wrong. That was the thing about Connor. He was rarely entirely wrong. What the government called reintegration was, in practice, a managed debasement. The cured were issued temporary residential permits tied to specific addresses. We were required to check in with rehabilitation officers weekly. We were prohibited from certain employment categories: law, medicine, government, education, anything with formal authority over other people. We were paid a subsistence allowance that covered rent and basic food if you were disciplined about it and nothing else. No savings. No trajectory. No means of building anything that extended more than a week into the future. The design of it was not accidental. It was the architecture of a society that had decided, without quite saying so in official language, that the cured were not quite people again, that they required management rather than rights. That generosity in this context meant keeping them fed and contained rather than simply disposing of them as the vocal minority in the opinion polls recommended. Connor, who had spent 8 years building a reputation at the bar before the virus took him, was assigned to a crew clearing rubble from the outer evacuation zones. He wore a high-visibility vest and carried a shovel, and said nothing about it to anyone for the first 3 weeks. The people who drove past the cordoned site sometimes shouted things from their car windows. Once, someone threw a bottle. The soldiers posted to oversee the work detail let it happen. Their orders, apparently, did not extend to protecting the workers. He took it. For a while he took it, with a patience that I understood better in retrospect than I did at the time. Connor's patience was not resignation. It was the patience of a man accumulating evidence, building a case. I worked at the treatment facility where Dr. Leon ran her lab. Joan Leon was the scientist who had developed the original cure, a small, precise woman who moved through the world as though she had already calculated where every obstacle was going to be and had decided which ones were worth acknowledging. She was trying to find a formulation that would reach the resistant 25%. The difficulty was that the resistance immune response was not uniform. The designation of 25% covered a spectrum of antibody profiles, some of which were closer to the cured population than the initial analysis had suggested. This was both a problem and, as she explained to me once while I was changing a supply cart in the corridor outside her lab, a potential lever. She said it the way scientists say things that are significant, flat, precise, without emphasis, as though the magnitude of what she was describing would become clear on its own without help from her voice. Her only active test subject was a woman named Joe Landecker, her colleague, her partner in the older and more complete sense of that word, who had helped design the original cure from the research side, and had then proved immune to it when the outbreak reached the laboratory where they worked. Joe was kept in a sealed containment unit in the facility's lower level. Dr. Leon visited her every morning at 7 and every evening at 6, and in all the months I worked there, I never once saw her expression change during those visits. Not the before or the after. Whatever those visits cost her, she paid it somewhere private and arrived in the corridor with a face that had been arranged into something functional and stayed that way. I pushed a mop. I changed linens. I carried equipment between rooms and signed for deliveries and noted things in logs. It was appropriate work, I thought. Something that needed doing. Something that accumulated no authority, left no mark, required no decision more significant than which corridor to do first. Abby did not treat me like a thing to be managed. That was the first surprise of the outside world, that someone could look at one of us and see the person rather than the category. She asked me questions about what I remembered, careful questions, journalist questions that left room for me not to answer, and she listened to what I said and did not flinch or redirect. She was working on a piece about the resistant, about the government's proposed solution to the resistant 25%, which was the kind of solution that doesn't require much elaboration if you've been paying attention to the 20th century. She asked me, one evening about 3 weeks after my release, what the resistant were actually like, whether they were in there somewhere, whether what you saw on the outside, the coordination, the hunger, the absolute absence of anything you could point to and call recognition, was the whole of it, or whether there was something beneath. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told her that what I remembered of it from the inside was not empty, that it was full, actually, overfull, that the self was not gone but compressed, reduced to a frequency the cure eventually managed to amplify back to something recognizable. I told her that the connection between infected individuals, the hive logic the military scientists couldn't fully map, felt from the inside like a very old form of knowing, pre-verbal, pre-individual. Something the species had discarded 100,000 years ago in favor of language and separation, and the particular loneliness of having one mind instead of many. She wrote that down. Then she put the pen down and looked at me and asked if I missed it. I said no. She said quietly that she believed me. I think she was right to believe me. I think I was telling the truth, but truth has edges, and what lives along those edges is not always the same shape as the center. The first time I saw the resistant mobilize as a unit, I was cutting through the old market district on my way back from the facility. It was dusk, the sky the particular bruised orange of a Dublin autumn evening, and I heard them before I saw them. Not sound exactly, more a change in the quality of the air, a pressure differential, the way the atmosphere shifts before a storm. Then they came around the corner of a bombed-out off-license in a loose, rolling formation, 30 or 40 of them, moving with that terrible purposeful synchrony that has no name in the military's tactical vocabulary, because it requires no command structure and no communication and no plan. It just is. They went past me without breaking stride. I stood against a wall and did not move, and they went past me, and I felt it again, faint and terrible, the pull, like an old frequency, like a scar that aches when the weather changes. A soldier appeared at the far end of the block and fired twice, and 2 of the resistant dropped, and the rest changed direction in absolute unison, not fleeing, not panicking, simply relocating, the way water roots around stone. I stayed against the wall until the silence came back. I called Cantor that night from the phone at the house and reported what I had seen. He arrived within the hour, which told me more about his actual concern for the situation than anything he had said in our kitchen meetings. He sat across from me again with his notebook, and this time the neutrality was more effortful. He asked exactly what I had observed. He asked whether any of the resistant had appeared to react to my presence. I told him no, which was true, and I told him I had felt the old pull, which was also true, and he looked at me for a long moment and wrote something that I couldn't read upside down. He said, carefully, that the resistant were not operating randomly. That intelligence from the evacuation zones suggested coordinated behavior on a scale and consistency that exceeded anything the military had previously documented. That the individual units moved within a larger architecture that nobody had yet fully mapped. I asked him what he was telling me. He said he was telling me to be careful. I asked him of what specifically. He said of everything. Connor's meetings had been going on for 6 weeks before I understood what they actually were. He had described them to me as discussion groups, cured individuals getting together to talk through the discrimination, the subsistence conditions, the employment restrictions. Support, he called it. Community. And it was that at first, or something close enough to it, that I let myself believe the description. 30, 40 people crowded into the back room of a pub that the owner, himself a cured former secondary school teacher, made available on Tuesday evenings. People talking about what had been taken from them, what they wanted back. I went twice and listened and said very little. The second time, walking home, Connor fell into step beside me and asked what I thought. I told him the anger was legitimate. He smiled and said the anger was the beginning and that the beginning was where we were. I asked him what came after the beginning. He said the part where we stopped asking. The bombing started 3 weeks after that conversation. Small ones at first, a recruitment office for the Integration Defense Volunteers, the civilian militia the government had authorized to support military operations in the evacuation zones. Nobody killed. Property damage only. The official statements called it terrorism and the Cured Alliance, the name Connor had chosen with the deliberateness he brought to everything. Did not claim responsibility but did not deny it either, and in the silence between accusation and denial, something shifted in the city's atmosphere. A hardening. I told Connor I was out. Not publicly, not with any drama. I waited until we were alone and I told him quietly, the way I had told him things since the facility, and he listened with that flat, attentive gaze, and when I finished he said he was sorry I felt that way. That the door was open if I changed my mind. He said it the way you say something you don't believe anyone will ever do. The next morning, he came to Abby's house for dinner. I cannot fully explain what he was doing there. I know he had spoken to Abby before, separately, through her journalist channels. She had interviewed him for the piece she was working on, found him compelling in the way compelling people always are when you're looking for a story with sharp edges. But the dinner felt like something else. He sat at the table where Cillian was doing homework, and talked with a warmth he had not shown in the cafe by the river, a softness that Connor deployed like a tool when he needed it and withdrew when he didn't. He talked about what it had been like before. He talked about the bar, about cases he remembered, about the way the law was supposed to be a thing that protected people from the arbitrary will of the powerful. Abby watched him the way she watched things she was trying to understand. Cillian watched him with the same frank animal assessment he had turned on me at the checkpoint gate. After dinner, when Connor had gone, Abby asked me what he really wanted. I told her I wasn't sure anymore. She said that was the wrong answer. She was right. I found out later, after, when the shape of everything was visible and it was too late to change it, that Connor had been at that dinner to see what he had to work with. What Abby knew. What I had told her. He understood that I was the loose thread and Abby was the journalist, and Cillian was the 9-year-old boy who sometimes walked home from school through the market district and knew which routes the resistant patrols used, the way children learn the geography of their fear. Connor had told me in the facility the one thing that Abby could not know, not because it was too painful, or not only because of that, but because it gave him something to use if he needed to use it. That is the thing about Connor that I understand now and did not understand then. He did not collect information the way journalists collect information, for the purpose of knowing. He collected it the way a strategist collects tactical options. Everything was a lever. Everyone was a fulcrum. He used it on a Thursday in the park, while Abby was watching Cillian on the climbing frame. I was not there. I heard about it afterward from Abby herself, her voice very level, journalist level, which meant she was frightened. Connor had sat beside her on the bench and made small talk, and then, in the same easy conversational register, told her to ask Senan how Luke really died. Not that Senan knew something. Not that there was a secret. Just ask him. Let the shape of it do the work. She asked me that evening. I had rehearsed this moment in my head many times, lying awake in the narrow bed of the room she had given me, and none of the rehearsals had felt like this. The words were correct, but the weight was wrong. She sat across from me, and I told her, in plain language, what I had done to her husband, my brother. In the first year of the infection, before the cure, before the facility, before the slow grinding return of the self that had done it, I told her that Connor had been there. That Connor had been the one who found Luke in the first place. I told her the rest of it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me to get out of the house. I went. Cantor found me sitting on the steps of the treatment facility at 11 o'clock at night. He had been looking, he said, which meant his surveillance resources were better than he had let on. He sat beside me on the steps, which surprised me. He was not a man who chose proximity casually, and we sat in silence for a while in the particular quiet of a city that still had curfews and still posted sentries at the intersections. He asked if I was ready to be useful. I said I needed to know what that meant. He told me about the Alliance's next meeting. He told me they had intelligence suggesting a major operation was being planned, not property damage this time. Something involving the containment facilities where the resistant were held. He said that what was needed was someone inside the meeting who Connor trusted. Someone who could provide enough of a signal to allow an arrest before the operation launched. I sat with that for a while. I thought about Abby, standing across the kitchen table from me with her journalist's steady voice and her frightened eyes. I thought about how she had looked when I told her about Luke, not broken, not theatrical, just very still in the way that people go still when something they have been holding in place for a long time finally moves. She had held herself together in that kitchen with a discipline that cost more than anyone watching could have measured, and then she had told me to leave, and she had been right too. I thought about Cillian, who had told me he didn't really remember me, with the frank honesty of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to manage other people's feelings, who walked home from school through the market district, who asked questions about his father in a tone that was carefully neutral, the way you ask questions when you've understood that the answer is probably going to cost you something. I thought about Luke. I thought about what I owed him and whether there was a currency for that kind of debt, and whether paying it in this particular way, becoming Cantor's instrument, giving Connor to the soldiers, was closer to redemption or simply to a different kind of wrong done in the name of a right outcome. I thought about how, in the infected years, there had been no such thing as a wrong done in the name of anything. There was only the tide. There was only the pull. The extraordinary freedom of not being required to choose. I had come back from that. Choosing was what I had come back to. I was going to use it. I told Cantor I would do it. The meeting was in a warehouse on the south side of the river, below the old quays, in a part of the city that had been partially evacuated and not fully resettled. Enough people back to create the impression of activity, not enough to crowd the streets or fill all the windows with light. 43 people, by my rough count. Former teachers, former clerks, a woman who had been a registrar in the city council offices, 2 men I recognized from the facility's 3rd processing cohort, an older man whose son had publicly disowned him in a newspaper interview that had been shared widely enough that most of us had seen it. People who had been reduced to their category and were trying to locate themselves on the other side of it. Connor stood at the front. He had not changed how he occupied a room, that particular barrister's stillness, the economy of movement, the sense of someone who has calibrated the attention in the space and knows exactly how much of it he holds and what to do with it. He had been building to this for months, and it showed in a specific way. Not agitation, not heat, not the crackling energy of a man who has finally arrived at the moment he's been pushing toward. Something quieter than that. The complete confidence of a man who believes the logic of the situation is so clear that emotion would only be a distraction from it. He laid it out simply. The resistant containment facilities were slated for decommissioning. The government's timeline was not public, but his sources inside the administrative apparatus had confirmed the schedule. Decommissioning was a word that had been chosen carefully, the way all the official language around this had been chosen carefully, clean, technical, suggesting a process rather than a decision. What it meant, plainly, was that thousands of people who could not be cured would be killed, because the government had calculated that the political cost of keeping them alive exceeded the political cost of ending them, and had decided accordingly. And the alliance, Connor said, was going to make a different calculation visible. The plan was simultaneous breach of multiple containment facilities, release the resistant into the city, force a situation in which the government's preferred solution, the quiet administrative one, became publicly untenable, replaced by a visible crisis that would require a visible response and could not be managed away in the language of decommissioning and appropriate resource allocation. He said it was not about causing chaos. I believed him, and I also believed that 400 resistant loose in a city with civilian populations would produce chaos that no one's intentions could prevent, because the resistant did not operate on the basis of anyone's intentions. They operated on the basis of the hive logic and the hunger, and the particular distributed intelligence that had no regard for the political outcomes of the people who had opened the gates. I kept my face steady. I thought about what I had seen in the market district, that rolling, fluid formation, the way they changed direction simultaneously without signal, the pull of it that I felt even at distance like a scar's ache. I thought about Cillian walking home from school through those same streets. When Connor moved to step outside with 2 of the inner circle, I made the signal Cantor had asked for. Then I waited. What happened next happened fast, the way violent things do when they finally arrive after a long period of knowing they are coming. The soldiers entered from 3 points simultaneously. People moved. Someone near the back threw something, a bottle, I think, or a chair leg. I heard shouting, and then the particular compressed sound of bodies being restrained by other bodies. And Connor walked directly toward me through the chaos, with his eyes on my face. I have known what it is to be seen through. When you have been part of a hive consciousness, when you have known, without words, the internal state of 30 other people at once, you develop a certain sensitivity to the moment when another person reads you completely. Connor read me in about 2 seconds. His expression did not change. He just looked at me with those flat measuring eyes, and something settled in them, not anger, nothing as simple as anger. Recognition. The kind that closes a door. He turned and went through the side exit before anyone could stop him. Cantor caught up with him outside alone, which was the kind of mistake that a careful man makes when he is operating at the edge of his resources. I heard it. Not the words. By the time I got outside, it was already over. Cantor was on the ground. Connor was gone. I stood in the street in the cold and looked at what Connor had left behind and understood that we had passed the point where this could be resolved through the machinery of legal authority. The machinery of legal authority was lying on the pavement. The city changed overnight. The resistant containment facilities, not all of them, not the central one where Dr. Leon kept her lab, but the outer facilities, the ones that hadn't been upgraded, breached before dawn, not because of Connor's plan. Because some of the Alliance members who had escaped the warehouse went ahead without him, without the coordination he would have insisted on, driven by whatever combination of fear and ideology, and the human tendency to do the thing you were going to do anyway once the decision is made. 400 resistant in the streets of a city that had spent 5 years learning to fear what 400 resistant represented. I need to be careful here, telling this part, because there is a temptation to describe it as a war, and it wasn't a war. A war implies two sides with equivalent agency. What happened that morning was something more like a weather event, something with internal logic, internal coordination, but no negotiation, no message, no demands. The resistant didn't want anything from us in the sense that wanting requires distance between yourself and the thing you want. They moved through the city the way that old internal pressure had always moved, not toward anything but inside everything, finding gaps, filling them. The hive logic was faster outdoors in the open without the containment protocols slowing it. I could feel the edge of it even from blocks away. Abby called me at 6 in the morning from the school. She had gone to get Cillian as soon as the broadcast started. Her voice was very level, and that meant she was very frightened, and she said they were locked in a classroom on the 2nd floor, and there were resistant in the schoolyard below, and could I come? I said I was coming. The city was unrecognizable in the way that cities become unrecognizable when the rules that govern them stop operating. Not destroyed, the infrastructure was largely intact, the buildings were standing, the street signs still pointed in accurate directions. But the human layer had been stripped back, and what was underneath was older than any of the arrangements we had built on top of it. Soldiers at the major intersections, firing lines established on the main avenues. Small groups of civilians moving fast between buildings, heads down, not looking at anything they didn't have to look at. The shutters were down on most of the ground floor businesses. A car had been abandoned in the middle of a junction, engine still running, the driver's door open, the radio playing something from a different world. And threading through the spaces between the military positions, through the alleys and the gaps between the shuttered shop fronts, the resistant not charging, not attacking directly, simply present in the way that water is present in a landscape, occupying every place that wasn't actively defended. They moved in loose groups of 4 and 5, sometimes a dozen, separated by streets but connected by something I could feel even at a distance. The hive logic was faster outdoors in the open, without the walls of the containment facilities breaking up the signal. You could see it in the way a group on one side of a block would shift direction at the exact moment a group 3 streets away encountered resistance. Distributed, reactive, coordinated without command. The military's tactical vocabulary had no word for it because no military doctrine had ever needed one. I had an advantage that nobody else on those streets had. I knew how it worked from the inside. I didn't move through the city the way a soldier moves, direct and purposeful and visible. I moved the way the resistant moved, along the edges, using the negative spaces, reading the pressure differentials that told me where their attention was anchored and where it wasn't. Not because I was still one of them, because I remembered being one of them, and memory, it turns out, is its own kind of map. The hardest part was not the resistant. The hardest part was the 2 blocks near the old market where a military cordon had been established, and I had to find a way through it without being taken into custody, because once you were in custody as a cured individual in a city that had just experienced a major breach, you were not coming out quickly. I lay in a doorway for 11 minutes while a 4-man patrol worked through their sweep pattern, and I thought about Cillian locked in that classroom, and I thought about Abby's voice on the phone, very level, very controlled, the journalist's steadiness that she used the way other people use medication, and I waited until the patrol turned north and I went south through the gap. I reached the school from the east, through the alley behind the old pharmacy. 2 resistant in the schoolyard had their attention on the main gate where a soldier was trying to establish a firing position. I went over the back wall while that attention held and crossed the yard in 12 seconds and went in through the fire exit and up the stairs, moving quietly enough that the sound wouldn't shift anything. The classroom door was locked from the inside. I knocked in the pattern Abby and I had used years ago before any of this, when we were just a family sharing a house, 2 quick, 1 slow, 2 quick. I had not thought about that pattern in 5 years. It came back without effort, the way certain knowledge comes back, not recalled but resurfaced, like something that was never gone but only waiting for the right conditions. The door opened. Cillian was sitting on a desk in the middle of the room with his jacket pulled tight, and his face doing the thing that children's faces do when they have decided that being frightened is not going to help, a kind of deliberate stillness that is harder to maintain than any adult gives them credit for. Abby was at the window. She turned when the door opened and her expression did a complicated thing, and then settled. She said, "I didn't think you'd come." I said, "I know." We moved back through the school the same way I had come in, fast and low and quiet, Cillian between us. At the top of the back stairs I heard movement below, not the particular movement of soldiers, the organized stamp and call of it, but the other kind, the fluid, gravity-obeying kind. I put my hand out and we stopped. 3 resistant below, moving through the corridor. They hadn't come up yet. The architecture of their attention was oriented toward the front of the building, toward the noise at the main gate. But attention in the hive logic is not fixed. It migrates. It follows information the way current follows the lowest path. I looked at Cillian. He was watching me with his father's eyes, Luke's eyes, dark and steady. And I thought about debt again, about currency, about whether there is a point at which what you owe becomes larger than what you have to give. I said very quietly that I needed them both to stay exactly where they were. Then I went down the stairs. I won't dress this up. I am not a soldier. I was a frightened man in his early 30s with 5 years of infected memory and a very specific kind of knowledge about how the coordinated attention of the resistant could be redirected. I made noise at the far end of the corridor, not panic noise, not the noise of prey, something different, something that carried the remnant frequency of what I had been, the ghost signal that I had spent 6 months in the facility trying to quiet. I don't fully understand the mechanics of it. The scientists wouldn't either if I tried to explain it. But the 3 of them turned toward me instead of the stairs, and I led them back through the corridor toward the front of the building and into the sight lines of the soldier at the main gate, and then I went flat against the wall, and the soldier took care of the rest. I went back up the stairs. Cillian looked at me when I came back and he said, "You came back." I said I would. He said, "Dad used to say that too." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. We went over the back wall and through the alley and into the streets, moving fast. Abby kept pace without being told to, reading the geometry of it the way she read everything, with her whole attention, quickly, trusting the analysis. Cillian ran without complaint. Connor found us 3 blocks from the house. He came around the corner of a shuttered newsagent and he stopped when he saw the 3 of us, and for a moment nobody moved. He looked at me, and then at Abby, and then at Cillian, and his face was doing something that I had not seen it do in all the time I had known him. It was not anger. It was not calculation. It was something rawer and older that he had kept very far down, and the events of the past 24 hours had brought it close to the surface. He said, "Senan." I said, "Let us go, Connor." He said, "You know I can't do that. Not now, she's a journalist. She's been filming our meetings." I said, "She's got a 9-year-old son who needs to get home." He said, "I know what she's got." The thing about Connor was that he was not cruel. I want to be precise about that, even now, because imprecision would be its own kind of dishonesty. He was not a man who wanted to hurt people for the satisfaction of it. He was a man who had decided that the world owed him a particular outcome, and that the only currency available was leverage, and that leverage, applied consistently, would eventually produce what persuasion and patience had failed to produce. He had arrived at a place where Abby and Cillian were leverage, and he had not chosen to be in that place. The logic of the situation had put him there, and Connor believed in the authority of logic. I said, "You're not going to do this." He said, "You don't know what I'm going to do." I said, "Yes, I do. You were a barrister. You defended people. That was what you spent 8 years doing before any of this happened. You argued in front of judges for the principle that people have rights that can't be removed just because someone in authority finds them inconvenient. That's what you spent all those years doing. That's who you are under all the rest of it." He was quiet. I said, "The part of you that organized the alliance, the legitimate part, the part that was right, it started from that. From the principle that people don't stop being people just because something happened to them that they didn't choose. That's what you were arguing. I know that. That was correct. That part was right." He said very quietly, "But you still gave me the canter." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you were going to open the facilities. You were going to open them and call it a political act, and it was going to be a massacre. Not because the resistant are monsters, we both know what they are, we've both been on the inside of it, but because 400 of them in a civilian city without any containment is not a political statement. It's just bodies, and you knew that. You made the calculation anyway." He said nothing. His jaw shifted slightly, the small muscular tell of a man who has been accurately described and has decided not to confirm it aloud. I said, "Cantor's dead. I know that. I'm not standing here pretending that doesn't matter, but so does this. This child matters, and the 8,000 people who are going to show up in the next broadcast's count of new cases, they matter too. They didn't choose any of this. Neither did we, but we at least got the cure. They don't have that yet." He said, very quietly, "The 25% didn't choose it either, and the government stated solution for them." I said, "I know what the government stated solution is. I work in the building where Dr. Leon is trying to find a different one. I've watched her. She is close, Connor, actually close. Not rhetoric, not hopeful language to keep the patients compliant. The science is there, the second formulation is moving, and what you did last night has made her job harder. The funding, the political climate, the access. You handed every argument to the people who want to skip straight to the clean, bureaucratic solution, and you handed it to them on a night when the streets were full." He looked at me for a long time. The look was not hostile. It was calculating in the way that all of Connor's looks were calculating, weighing the information against the model, checking for errors. He said, "You believe she can do it." I said, "I believe the alternative is giving up, and I don't think either of us is capable of that. It might be the only genuinely human thing we have left, the specific inability to look at a situation that is terrible and simply stop." I looked at Cillian, standing beside Abby with his father's steady dark eyes, and I said, "I gave you to Cantor because of them, because I would not allow the worst thing to happen to them when I had the means to prevent it, even if it cost me everything else, even if it cost me you." Connor looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Cillian. The boy had not moved through any of it, had stood with that careful stillness of a child who understands that the adult conversation happening around him is important, and that the best contribution he can make is to be absolutely present and not add to the weight of it. He had his jacket pulled tight around him. His eyes were dark and steady. They were Luke's eyes, and I could not look at them directly for very long. Something shifted in Connor. I watched it happen. I cannot name precisely what moved, whether it was some last fragment of the man who had argued for human dignity in courtrooms, or simple exhaustion, or the recognition that the mathematics of the situation had changed in ways that his models had not accounted for. Some doors, when they open, do not show their hinges. Some things move inside people that have no external mechanism you can point to. He stepped back. He turned and walked away and disappeared around the corner of the shuttered newsagent without looking back, and somewhere in the middle distance there was a short burst of military fire, and then shouting, and then a silence that had a different quality than the silence before it. I never saw him again. The reports in the weeks that followed listed him first as missing, then as a person of significant ongoing interest to the authorities, then as simply unaccounted for, one of several senior alliance figures who had scattered into the city during the operational period and not been recovered. His face appeared on official notices attached to lamp poles. Then, some weeks after that, it appeared on something different, materials from the Cured Alliance's newly registered political wing, which had reorganized itself in the aftermath of the breach into something that looked, from a distance, like the earliest stages of a legitimate political movement. It used words like rights and representation and accountability and proportionate response. It did not use words like bombing or insurgency or leverage. I don't know exactly what to make of that. I've thought about it often in the months since, and I haven't arrived at a clean position. Some people would say it was the best possible outcome. Some people would say it was Connor continuing to do what Connor had always done, pursuing the conclusion he'd already decided on, simply adjusting the method when one approach stopped working. I think both of those things might be true at the same time, and I've stopped expecting truth to arrive in a form that doesn't require you to hold contradictions. We got back to the house. The city was quiet by that evening, not resolved, not healed, not fixed in any way that would last, but functionally quiet, the military back in their positions, the breach contained. The count of new infected being compiled with the same careful bureaucratic neutrality that had characterized every official communication since the beginning. 8,000 new cases in custody. The formula familiar by now, the response familiar, the machinery of it all operating with a grinding confidence that it would eventually arrive at a solution. Cillian was bitten on the way back. I am telling you this plainly because there is no version of the story where I can make it clean. A resistant moving through the space between two buildings, alone, separated from whatever coordination it had been operating within, whether driven by desperation or by some fragment of old hive logic seeking a new anchor. I don't know, came out of a doorway fast, and Cillian was in the wrong position, and I was not quite fast enough. It was a surface wound. The virus does not require depth. Any doctor will tell you that. I stood in the street holding Cillian's arm, looking at the mark, and I ran the mathematics of it, and I came to the only answer the mathematics permitted. I am immune. The cured are immune to subsequent infection. The antibody profile from the original cure provides complete protection. That is the one thing the virus gave back when the cure took everything else away. It gave back immunity. I told Abby. She listened. Then she sat down on the curb in the street in the quiet city, and she put her hands over her face, and I sat beside her and did not say anything for a while because there was nothing to say that would make the mathematics different. When she looked up, she asked me, "Can you keep him safe?" I said, "Until Dr. Leon finds the second formulation, yes." She asked how long that would take. I told her I didn't know. She said, "Will you bring him back to me?" I said, "Yes." I want to be careful about this word. I have said yes to things before and the weight of the word has varied. Standing in the facility corridor, saying I understood about Luke. Standing at Cantor's kitchen table, saying I would be useful. The weight was different each time, calibrated to what I was willing to spend. This one had a different weight than any of those. This one was the full weight of everything I had left, which was not a large amount in total but was, I thought, sufficient. She held Cillian for a long time, and then she let him go. He took my hand and we walked. Some weeks later, a broadcast announced that order had been restored, that the new infected were in appropriate facilities, that the government was committed to a humane and comprehensive response. The tone was careful, official, the tone of people who have decided that confidence and uncertainty sound similar enough if you control the microphone. In the background of the broadcast footage, if you knew what to look for, you could see posters on the walls of the civic buildings. The Cured Alliance's political material, the new registered version, Connor's face among the others. Dr. Leon called me on the frequency we had established for secure communication. She said she was close. Not there, but close. She said the second formulation was behaving differently than the first, that the resistance antibody response was proving more variable than the resistant 25% designation implied, which was both a complication and, potentially, a way in. She said she needed more time. I told her she had it. I'm sitting now in a room in a building I'm not going to describe, with Cillian asleep in the next room and the sound of a city outside that is, slowly, against all reasonable probability, learning to be a city again. He's been sick, the way you're sick in the early stages, feverish, disoriented, losing days at the edges, waking in the night and not knowing where he is, calling out for Abby in a voice that has the particular quality of a child's voice when the performance of being fine has dropped away, and what's left is just the fear. I sit beside the bed in those moments, and I don't say much because there isn't much to say that would be true and useful at the same time. I stay there until he goes back under, and then I go back to the chair. He asks for his mother. I tell him she's waiting. That's true. I tell him we're going back when the doctor has what she needs. That's also true, or I believe it to be true, which is the best I can offer and which has to be enough. The gap between what I believe and what I can guarantee has always been the place where the hardest things live. I know that better than I used to. Dr. Leon calls me on the frequency we established for secure communication, every third day, never longer than 4 minutes. She gives me the same information in different configurations, not to mislead, but because the data keeps shifting and she reports it accurately as it moves. The second formulation is behaving differently than the first. The resistance antibody profile is more variable than the original designation implied, which means the 25% category contains subpopulations that the initial research collapsed into a single block because the tools weren't refined enough to distinguish them. She is refining the tools. She is close, she says. In the careful, measured way she says things that are significant, not close in the way people say close when they need you to feel encouraged, but close in the way a person says it when the evidence has moved to within a calculable distance of a conclusion. I told her on the last call that she had as much time as she needed. She said without inflection, I know, I'm not calling because I need permission. I'm calling because you deserve to know where it is. I thought about that for a while after she rang off. He asked me 3 days ago whether I was scared. I thought about it before I answered. Not the way you pause to seem thoughtful, but the way you pause when the question actually requires navigation. When the honest answer is not a single clean thing, but a shape with several sides, and you're deciding how much of it to show to a 9-year-old boy who is feverish and frightened and entitled to the truth, but also needs to sleep. I thought about the facility corridor and the careful breathing. 2 in through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth. The young woman with the clipboard pressed flat against her chest like a ward against something. I thought about Connor in the cafe, his hands around the tea, looking out at the Liffey with the flat, reasonable certainty of a man who has decided that the world owes him an outcome and is going to collect it. I thought about Dr. Leon in the corridor outside the containment unit on the lower level, her face arranged into something functional, paying whatever it cost in whatever currency she kept private. I thought about Luke, which I do every day and have not found a way to stop doing and have given up trying. I thought about the market district at dusk, the pressure differential, the pull, warm and ancient and wrong and familiar. I told Cillian, yes, I'm scared. He said, me too. I said, that's all right. He said, is it? I said, it means you're paying attention. The ones who stop being scared are usually the ones who have stopped looking. We need to keep looking for a while longer. He was quiet for a moment. In the way of children who take ideas seriously, he appeared to be actually considering it, checking the logic against his own experience, which even at 9 was real experience, a child who had grown up in the aftermath of things that were not designed for children to grow up in and had developed accordingly. Then he nodded, with a gravity that was entirely his own, and pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes and went back under. I sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the city went on with the business of being a city in the early hours, the sounds that cities make when most of the human layer is asleep and what's left is the structural hum of the thing itself. A siren somewhere far to the north, a dog, the particular sound of a military vehicle on wet pavement, moving slowly, the patrol rhythm. Rain beginning again, the way it begins in this city, without announcement, as though it was always there and just became audible. Ordinary sounds, or the sounds of an ordinary that is still being built from what survived the extraordinary, piece by piece, tested against what it will have to hold. I don't know how this ends. That's not a rhetorical position. I mean it plainly and without drama. I genuinely do not know. Dr. Leon might find the second formulation in time, or she might not. Cillian might come through the early stages and back to himself, or he might not. The city outside might arrive, eventually, at something stable enough to be called peace, or the machinery of fear and bureaucratic convenience might make the clean administrative choice again. And the resistant in the new facilities might be decommissioned just as quietly as the previous ones were scheduled to be. I don't know. I can't control it. I don't have the leverage that Connor spent months trying to accumulate, and I've watched where that leverage led. What I have is this: a chair by a window, a boy in the next room breathing, a phone that rings every third day with 4 minutes of careful truth from a woman who believes the evidence is moving in the right direction, a city that is still, against considerable odds, a city. What I know is this: I came back from the dark once already. I know what it cost, the specific weight of it, the things you give up when you choose to come back to the self and carry everything that self has done. I know what it gave back, too. The ability to choose. The ability to sit in a chair and be afraid and stay anyway. The ability to make a door-knock pattern matter because you learned it when you were still a person who had a family and a future. And it came back without effort when you needed it, which is the thing memory does when what it holds is real. I know the sound of a child's breathing in the room next to mine, shallow and feverish, fighting to stay himself. And I know what it means to keep paying attention. That's not nothing. It will have to be enough.